What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Cheeky Midweeky, where our goal here is to make strength and conditioning not boring. And this week's guest, all right, we have Jason, and we are going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to a lot of strength coaches' heart. ACL injuries, knee injuries. Like, this is something where a lot of coaches, they don't want to hear those three letters. And my man here is going to drop some knowledge on us. I got my pens, I got my notepad, I'm ready to listen up.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. This is Thursday morning right now. We're in spring season right now, postseason play for some of our Olympic sport athletes coming up here over the next couple of weeks, so it's an exciting time. But yeah, like you said, want to chat a bit about some of the ACL work that I've done previously and some of my previous stops, and then also to talk more on a philosophical level about, kind of our thoughts of this injury over the last 20, 25 years, kind of where we were initially in the mid-2000s and then kind of where we're progressing and where I kind of see ACL injuries from a risk mitigation standpoint, and now how that can also be some helpful information to some of the practitioners in the field, whether it be strength and conditioning, sports medicine, any sort of folks that may deal with this injury. Because unfortunately, if you go back and start looking at, injury prevalence, things like that, like the injury rates have not really declined at all over the last 20 to 25 years, even though there's been a lot of, money and research that's been poured into this, trying to understand, mechanisms, so on and so forth. But if you look at the last, 20, 25 years, like injury rates across the board, whether that be adolescent athletes, collegiate athletes, professional athletes, really actually hasn't gone down at all. And I have a few kind of underlying theories as to why that may be, and definitely want to chat about some of that stuff. So yeah, exciting topic, gets me going. Spent a lot of time during my master's and Ph.D. and my postdoc, really studying this injury from a lot of different perspectives. I can talk about ACL injuries for hours and hours and hours. I can really get on some tangents with some folks. So I'm excited to have a chat here about it.
Dive in, man. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Let's. I think probably the best place to start is kind of walk through the history of the injury and kind of what our initial thoughts were, and then kind of how, as we progress through the injury, looking at it, from various research perspectives, kind of where we're at now, at least kind of where I view the injury and my mental model and heuristics, and kind of what I see going forward. So, gotta kind of start back in like the mid 2000s is where you start to see when we're talking about this, I'm talking about it purely from a non-contact standpoint. With the contact injuries, there's just a lot of other extraneous
Why don't you
variables.
go ahead and define it for people? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, okay, yeah, for sure. So non-contact ACL injury, typically defined as an ACL injury once there isn't any direct contact to the knee or the surrounding areas there. But that can also include an injury where an athlete gets like bumped in the upper extremity and it still leads to an ACL injury. So you have, that's
still called non-contact though, right?
Right. It's typically called indirect contact. So three kind of classifications. You have your pure contact injury where a running back runs through the hole, lineman dives into him, boom, ACL tears. That's one that there's just a lot of extraneous kind of factors. Then you have the second one where it's like your indirect contact. So athlete goes up for like a rebound, gets bumped in the shoulder, lands, and then ACL pops. So not necessarily a direct contact to the knee or the lower extremity, but still contact nonetheless. And then the third one is just like your pure non-contact injury. Wide receiver goes across the flat, catch the ball, decelerates, boom, ACL tear. Similar to like kind of Odell Beckham's, I think, from a couple years ago, where wasn't any sort of contact, lower upper extremity, just a pure non-contact. But from a theoretical perspective, and this is where a lot of this research has come from, we think that the indirect and the non-contact ones are the ones that are quote-unquote preventable, whereas your contact type, and we'll get into that for the whole injury prevention side of things, and but the non-contact ones, there's just a lot of other factors. A 300-pound lineman dives into your knee, like there's not really much you can do at that point. But you could also make the argument that you could potentially, through some different strategies, have athletes avoid those types of situations in the first place. But that kind of gets into a whole nother tangent. But yeah, that's kind of the classical, classifications of ACL. So I've spent my time pretty heavily on the pure non-contact, but also too getting into some of the indirect contact as well, because that's things that our athletes are going to experience a lot. They're still going to get bumped. They're still might not be to the knee itself, but there's still perturbations that our athletes have to navigate, whether that's soccer, basketball, football, so on and so forth.
No, I 100% agree. And I had a colleague who he was working with women's lacrosse, and one of his girls,
Sport, yep.
she got pushed from the back, like she was
Yep.
going to get a ball, pushed from the back in a penalty, like it was an illegal contact, but her knee, she wound up tearing her ACL, and the athletic trainer was like, "Oh, it's a non-contact injury," and he's like, "Whoa, wait a minute! Like, had that girl not gotten pushed in the back, that knee injury never would have happened." Like,
Sure. Yeah, that one we would define as indirect. So indirect.
like, but it's
contact.
not indirect. Like, they directly
Right.
got hit.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. That's just how it's
Yeah,
typically,
classified by
defined.
doctors, right? Like that's
Right.
it. All trickles down from like, okay, what a surgeon would call it, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, within the history of it, you started talking about the 2000 and non-contact. Like, when was the different classifications? When did it start? How are we going about with this?
I think you really started to get those classifications kind of later on in that process. It was
Okay.
the early 2000s research. It was just really like the pure non-contact injury, right? Athlete goes to do a sidestep cutting maneuver and boom, ACL tears. Those are sort of the ones, or like the jump landings too. Athletes going up for a rebound, no contact at all, and then land, ACL pops. So that was really kind of the first kind of goal, is like the pure non-contact type of injury. How can we, one, predict the injury through various assessments and talk about some of the inherent limitations there, and then also two, kind of coinciding, okay, if we could predict, then in theory we could prevent, and then what are some, I guess, preventative strategies that we can do. So early 2000s research, you started to see a lot of like jump landing biomechanics research come out. Tests like the drop vertical jump, the landing error scoring system, some things that some of the listeners may be familiar with and have implemented before. And some of that research, at least initially, was pretty heavily focused in the adolescent female population, because that's where you see a lot of ACL injuries, and that kind of gets into a whole other tangent about how females may be at higher risk for males. A lot of people, speculate it could be anatomical, could be physiological, could be hormonal. I actually don't really buy into any of those three, because if you look at, a lot of this research, it's female adolescent athletes as a whole, and I'm being very general here, don't necessarily have equal training opportunities as a male adolescent athlete for a lot of reasons. There's still some stereotypes about female athletes, weight training and the frequency in which they do it. But if you really look at a lot of these early studies, they don't necessarily control for training age. And they look at, male versus female risk factors, and females have more stiffer landing strategies or dynamic valgus. But we've seen through, tailored training, a lot of these risk factors sort of kind of get mitigated. So that's kind of it's a whole separate tangent there. But essentially they were starting to look at, okay, what are some assessments that we could do that could identify athletes who would be at a higher risk or predicting, ACL non-contact injuries. And so some of the research in the early 2000s, again, looking at a couple of those tests, drop vertical jumps, landing error scoring system, tests that, in theory would be great to roll out for a full football team or for a full soccer club, things like that, to where I could do this test, I could screen, I could say this athlete's at high risk, this athlete's at moderate risk, this athlete's at low risk for injury, and then we provide our interventions based on that. Like, in theory, sounds great. And there was a particular paper that came out on the mid 2000s that did identify, so there's around 210 adolescent female athletes. They were from some different sports, basketball, soccer, a couple of like your more classic jump landing type of sports. I think there's volleyball in there as well. Nine of the athletes did end up going on and sustaining a non-contact ACL injury, and then the remaining part of the cohort did not. So you had your group there, and you had your larger group that didn't. And what they found is that of those 9, the dynamic knee valgus moment was significantly higher than in the non-injured cohort. And that paper really started to, it funneled through, got a lot of recognition.
What paper was that?
This is the Hewitt paper in 2005 out of the American Journal of Sports Medicine. If readers are interested, definitely can provide the citation, things like that. But that was really the first paper that started to get at, okay, here's a potential mechanism of a non-contact ACL injury. And I think since then, in 2005, like that's really the thing that people look at, right? It's like, okay, where's the dynamic knee valgus? Where's the knee valgus? We need to train out of knee valgus. Like an athlete demonstrate that, oh boy, that's a red flag. And so and that really, like I said, that's about 2005, so about 18 years ago, around that 25 year-ish range. And ever since then, that's really been, from a grassroots level, you talk to parents, you talk to some coaches and stuff, that's what they'll tend to go to first. Is like, okay, when I see an athlete and they, have the knock knees or things like that, they're like, oh boy, that athlete's at a high risk, or that athlete needs to be trained out of that. And for better or worse, some of that has still kind of stuck around. But as you started to read more of the research, and there's been follow-up studies that have done similar types of analyses, different ages, different athlete cohorts, and they've done similar tests too, drop verticals, other sort of like sidestep cutting, things like that. And what we've started to see over the last 15 years is those other researchers who have done these, again, prospective studies, longitudinal, looking at those who did end up sustaining a non-contact versus those who are injury-free or control cohorts, actually haven't really been able to replicate those initial findings.
Really?
In terms of dynamic knee valgus or any sort of knee biomechanics actually being predictive of future non-contact ACL injury events. So
why is everybody saying that then?
I think honestly, just that was kind of the first, and one of the things too is like knee valgus is very easy to see, right? Like it's something that from a macro level, a coach can identify, a practitioner, someone who doesn't have experience can see, oh yeah, that person has knee valgus. Boom, that's something that I can easily see, and now I can try to quote unquote train that athlete out of it. That's where I think a lot of that comes from. It's very easy to see someone who has knee valgus or bad knee biomechanics, so on and so forth. So that's where I kind of think like that was something that someone could latch onto very easily and say, okay, that person's at a high risk. I can visibly see their knee valgus when they do any sort of drop landing or jump cutting, all that sort of stuff. That's why I think it's stuck around, because it's easy to see. But as I'll kind of talk about here in a second, the sensory motor aspect of it is you can't see it. Like you can't see someone has a bad working memory. You may be able to kind of glean a little bit, but you can't necessarily macroscopically see that compared to someone who just has bad biomechanics. That's where I think I kind of took off. But as I was saying, like the studies that have followed that really haven't been able to identify knee valgus or any sort of knee biomechanical variables that were predictive. So I'd say, you're looking at it as a whole in terms of ACL injury biomechanics and predicting future events. I would say about 90% of the research actually says that it doesn't. And there's a few studies in addition to that Hewitt paper that have identified, but as a whole, the majority of the research hasn't been able to identify knee biomechanics as future predictors of ACL injury. And I think there's a few reasons as to why. One is just the types of tests that are being done in these environments, being sport specific, being very sterile types of environments. Like we've all done drop vertical jumps, right? We've all done that test. You hop off a box of a 30 centimeter box. You jump down. You cue an athlete to jump as high as you can. We've all done that test. We've all we've seen that test, but it's a bilateral type of test, right? Where if we reverse engineer the actual ACL injury, very rarely does it happen in a purely bilateral type of movement. It tends to be more unilateral dominant, whether it's a jump cut or whether it's a jump landing. So that kind of is kind of a major kind of red flag with an assessment like that. It's like you don't tend to see non-contact ACL injuries occur in a purely bilateral type of maneuver, which a drop vertical jump is. So there's that, and it's also too is this kind of gets into more of the sensory motor aspects. Like when you watch an athlete in a non-contact ACL injury, whether on the football field, soccer field, one of the main things that you'll start to see when you're picking up from a more mechanistic standpoint is their focus of attention isn't actually on, how they're performing the movement. It's on the external environment, where the defenders are, where they are in relation to the field, whether they're near the out of bounds boundaries, where their teammates are. Like, you start to watch it and you start to see they really tend to be externally focused. Whereas when you do these types of assessments, it tends to be more of an internally dominant task where there's no focus on anything else. It's just the athlete, okay, I'm going to drop off the box now, and then I'm going to land, and then I'm going to jump up. Like that's where the focus is. And they've tried to kind of mitigate that through like hanging like a ball or some sort of apparatus and say, try to reach the ball and jump up as high as you can to try to get more externally focused driven. If folks are familiar with some of the motor learning research that's out there, but still at the end of the day, like it's a pre-planned task. You step off a box, you land, you jump up. Whereas in sport, we know that that's not the case 99.9% of the time. Our athletes are often having to be reactive to the environment as opposed to, this idea of being everything being pre-planned. So that's where I think a lot of the disconnect comes from, is that, and I've been in these lab environments. I've gone through a master's in biomechanics, gone through a Ph.D. in biomechanics. I've conducted research similar to this in biomechanics lab, so I fully understand that side of things. But also, too, now being a practitioner and being in the field, I can kind of see this injury from both sides. And it's tough, too, because, from a research perspective, this is a much easier way of doing it and being able to screen hundreds and hundreds of athletes through, being able to do your biomechanical analyses. But at the end of the day, that sort of research hasn't really moved the needle. It hasn't provided clinicians and practitioners with very useful information in terms of these are the injury screening assessments that we can potentially do to try to see who's at risk. These types of assessments that we've done classically hasn't moved the needle. And so that's kind of started in, full disclosure, like when I first got into ACL injury, late into my undergrad, into my master's, like I was fully kind of on board with the biomechanical aspects of it. I was in that line of thinking of knee valgus. We got to train out knee valgus. This is the main one. But as I started to read more of the research, it kind of changed my mental model. I'm like, I don't necessarily think that this is the end all be all. I think there's something different. And kind of a little side story here. It's actually when I started to get into more concussion research is when I started to make the connection between the idea of the brain and how that potentially influences and downstreams into an injury like this. So just a little side note here. My Ph.D. research was looking at the relationship between concussion and non-contact lower extremity injuries and potentially the mechanisms as to why.
Okay.
And
what sports?
There's a lot of I was in my last couple studies were in a couple different sports, so football, soccer, and volleyball. Some of your more heavy concussion sports. And then did a couple studies with adolescent athletes when I was out at UNLV. But essentially what the research was at that point with concussions is that post-concussion, athletes were at higher risk for ankle injuries, knee injuries, your non-contact type of injuries. And so I started to read that research, the injury surveillance research. I was like, this is kind of interesting. I wonder if folks have ever tried to look at like a mechanistic link between a concussion and then a non-contact ankle sprain or an ACL type of injury, things like that, meniscus injury. And really at that point, back in 2018, there hadn't really been a lot of research out there that looked at it from a mechanistic perspective. So that's what my PhD research was focusing on, some of the biomechanics, but then also some of the neuropsychological aspects between sport concussion and then future risk for a lower body injury. But then I started to think as I was going through my PhD and finishing up there, I started to think, okay, what if you remove the concussion from the equation? Athletes hasn't had a concussion history. What are some of the neuropsychological sensory motor aspects that may just play directly into a non-contact injury such as an ACL? And that's when I really have just started, and this is probably back in 2020-ish, about 2020-ish, is when I really started to just focus on removing the concussion, and I still have a lot of interest in the concussion non-contact relationship, but removing the concussion from the equation, what are some of the sensory motor aspects that may be driving this relationship and ultimately may be a better way of going about thinking about mechanisms for ACL injury. So that's kind of how I've walked through my own scientific endeavors and research about this ACL injury. I was initially on that pure biomechanics train, but I thought as kind of I've studied the injury more over the last 6-7-ish years, I think there's something more that we need to tap into that can start to help us start to reduce the risk of this injury and start to see these injury incidences decline. And full disclosure as well, ACL injury, in my opinion, is probably the most complicated injury we see in sports medicine. There's just so many different factors that could potentially get involved in a non-contact. It may be anywhere from the surface on the field, the weather, prior injury history, current training. There's so many different factors, and folks that try to say, this is the mechanism or that is the mechanism is just way off base and quite frankly providing just really bad information and trying to sell people on like, okay, this is the cure all catch all thing. It's so complicated. But I think, and this is where as the research evolves and the science evolves, you can take different aspects of different strategies and interventions and hopefully combine those aspects together to create a comprehensive program. It's not easy. Like, it's not easy by any means. But that's just kind of, my thoughts. And I try to take a very 30,000-foot view on this injury, just because it is something I'm very, very passionate about and love to study. But at the end of the day, I just think there's more to it than just your knee valgus or doing a drop vertical jump test.
I 100% agree. And the way that my athletic trainer and I, the way that we would assess anybody that came in, we would look at, like, he would do a orthopedic screen and look at their joints and how they would move. Just, kind of following any of the FRC principles, like, hey, if your hip doesn't move, you don't have a hip, blah, blah, blah. There's going to be issues.
Right.
Then we would look at our lower body assessment of jumping. We would do a single leg vertical with a double leg takeoff, a single leg drop jump off of a 9-inch box to a double leg landing, and then a single leg broad jump to a double leg landing. And if we saw 2 out of the 3 with an asymmetry, we're like, hey, there's something going on here. Now, that was purely looking at physical. It was not looking at sensory motor.
Right. One of the things, though, that you mentioned, though, and that's important there, is you did a lot of that unilateral.
All of it unilateral with a double leg land. So that way, and that's where I think a lot of people get this stuff wrong, where they make it a single leg. Like, Kyle would also do a single leg takeoff to a single leg land, just to check the boxes, because that's what the prior research has, but also just as a different way of collecting. But I was like, nah. And this is from where DeMarco and I worked together at Iowa, and we'd always bounce ideas off each other. It's like, look, I want a double leg land because I don't want them to worry about how they land. I want them to do maximal power production, let them land on 2 so we can see how powerful that leg really is. Now, none of that dials the sensory motor in, and you're the expert in it, and sticking with the Keir Wyndham flat ratio. You've noted the issues with it. What do you recommend to all of our listeners out there? Like, what would be the Jason A test, or like, what, you come up with something flashy for it, but like, what would you do?
Yeah, sure. And this is where the research is, you can be creative in fitting, like, what are going to be the demands of your athlete, right? Like an American football athlete versus a soccer athlete.
Shit, within American football, all the different positions, no?
Sure. Oh yeah, like, for sure. One of the things that we've started to explore, again, you kind of reverse engineer the injury itself. And when does it tend to happen? It tends to happen when an athlete's more in like a deceleratory maneuver, right? Like they're going to do a jump cut or they're going to do a jump land. It's more in that deceleration phase. So there's ways that you can be creative in terms of your screening. What I would recommend to practitioners in terms of doing more field-based screening assessments is I would do it both under a pre-planned scenario, and then I'd also do it under a reactionary scenario, unplanned scenario, because where this starts to get into is this idea now of sensory motor. So like, say for example, you're going to do some sort of deceleration test, like the Damian Harper type of test, where
don't know what that is. I don't know.
Don't know what that is?
Yeah, what is it?
Okay, yeah. If folks don't know what that is, essentially there's like a 15-meter buildup, and then there's like a 5-meter deceleration zone where it's a pure sprint out, and then you're into this deceleration zone, and you're decelerating as quickly as possible.
Decelerating and hitting a line like the 505 test, or like you sprint 15 yards and have to stop before the 5-yard mark.
You have to stop before the end of the 5-yard mark.
And are you measuring how fast somebody runs in the 15 so that way they're not cheating it, or what? Because I've seen things like. Yeah.
So you can use timing gates or GPS technology, things like that. So that tends to be more of a pre-planned sort of scenario there, where an athlete starting, builds up, boom, the deceleration starts right at that initial box part. But then you could also make it unplanned as well, where they're accelerating out, and then you still have, you maybe have like a larger deceleration area, but they don't start the deceleration until there's some sort of external cue, whether that's auditory or visual.
Now, how do you control for the randomization? Because I hear what you're saying. Like, hey, it's still a 20-yard drill, right?
Right.
Except they knew by the 15 to slow down. Like, how do you control
Right.
for the randomization of if you're going to run a bunch of athletes through it? And how do you measure it? Are you videoing it? What are you doing? How do you recommend it?
Right. So a couple of different things from a randomization standpoint. I would say what you're going to have to do there is your cueing is going to have to be similar.
Using a whistle, like what?
Could be auditory, could be visual, and there's going to be a little bit of variance within that, but that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world because you're going to see variance on the field as well. It's not going to be standard. But really the main aspect there is you want to see how an athlete decelerates under a pre-planned scenario and then also how they decelerate under a more reactionary scenario. And then two, kind of getting to your point, Justin, a couple different things there is video analysis is going to be helpful here. You can get that from sagittal plane. You can get that from frontal plane as well. And of course, if you're trying to add, some sort of a cutting task to it as well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a pure deceleration, a pure, vertical, anterior, posterior type of test. You can also add a medial lateral component to it as well. But that would kind of be, I guess, a recommend. And like I said, you can be creative in this as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be that sort of assessment. If you wanted to do like a flying 10 and a cut to the left, cut to the right, two of those are pre-planned, and then two of those are going to be reactionary, where there's a cue here and you got to cut to the left, cue here, you got to cut to the right.
How would you score it though? That's the thing, because like I agree with you. Like, yeah, there's. Okay, you can make a pre-planned not, and then it's just like, okay, in terms of maybe it's messy and you don't score it, and it's qualitative research, not quantitative.
Right.
I hear what you're saying with that.
Right.
And then the other part of my brain is I'm like, okay, we talked off air about, okay, there's already a lot of work on strength coaches' plates and now your plates. Like, who's going to filter through it? Is it you? Is it the AT? Is it the strength coach? How are we filtering through? How are we going to then communicate it? How are we going to, is there an intervention to improve it or not? Because it's just standard training. Like, all these thoughts are going through my head. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think, I'm going to be a little bit biased here because we do have a sports scientist in house and a group of folks to help out. It really is going to be and I think ideally this is in collaboration with sports science, strength conditioning, and sports medicine. With one of our teams going into the summer, we actually will be rolling out a pretty comprehensive assessment with myself in our sports medicine group and our strength group for this particular team on campus. We'll all be collaborating, collecting the data. But yeah, really, it's going to be bespoke to your environment and what's going to allow you, to collect, as much or as much data as you think is going to be needed. But like Dos Santos actually has, I could, provide a link here of more of like a jump cutting quality assessment form. I can provide
Dos Santos in what year?
This is pretty recently. I want to say 2021. Nice. Don't quote me on that necessarily. But yeah, it depends. Honestly, Justin, it's gonna depend on what you have in your environment. Like here, we do have a lot of different technologies.
Every bell and whistle, sorry.
Every sort of bell and whistle to be able to collect more granular type of information. Like in terms of like deceleration testing, like we can look at different phases of the actual deceleration with our GPS technology. It provides us some good insight into like what's an athlete's maximal deceleration abilities, but then also two, pairing that with high-speed video, and then two, looking at that from a quantitative and also a qualitative standpoint. But I do recognize like there are practitioners in the field and listeners who may not have access to that, but it will take a little bit of creativity. It's not impossible to do. It's just going to have to take a little bit of ingenuity and thoughts. My whole thing from this is like, you just want to remove the athletes from the pre-planned type of maneuvers. The pre-planned drop vertical jump, the pre-planned, okay, I'm going to do a 5-10-5. Like, it's just not what an athlete's going to be exposed to on the field, and it's not going to be where the high injury risk events are going to be. It's going to be under these chaotic sort of conditions. And I kind of liken this to, some of the things that we do in the weight room, like in terms of like how weight room things translate onto the field. Like, our strength barometer, our strength metrics, things like that. Yes, it's not exactly sports specific. Like a squat is not sports specific. Things like that are not necessarily the most sports specific things we do in the world. But we're trying to train the underlying qualities of the athlete to hopefully that stuff translates on the. It's same thing with a lot of these sensory motor type of test. Like, yes, like if we use like a smart board type of technology, obviously a smart board technology is not going to be something that an athlete's doing on the field, but
Correct.
we're trying to train some of these underlying qualities from a reaction standpoint, a working memory standpoint, that hopefully have a bit of translation to what an athlete's going to experience on the field. I can talk a little bit about some of the other training interventions things too, if that's something that you think the listeners may be interested in.
Yeah, no, let's talk about the different interventions. And I mean,
Sure.
I guess the biggest question that everybody's asking and that, people want to hear is ACL injury preventable? Like, is it preventable with these contact, non-contact? What are your thoughts?
End of the day, like if you were to ask me straight up, are we going to ever find a solution to prevent ACL injuries? No, we're not going to. There's so many factors that play a role, and you get into some of the dynamical systems theory aspect of the injury where these different parameters interact with each other and they're changing. No, I don't think we'll ever get to that point, but we can provide a more comprehensive solution so that on a macro scale, we can reduce the risk of the group. That's kind of what you're trying to get to.
Yeah.
But from a prevention standpoint, no, it'll never happen. From a prediction standpoint, like a pure prediction, probably not. Probably not going to get there either. But that's okay though, because on a group level standpoint, we can still provide best practices and still, hopefully reduce the risk as a whole. But from a training standpoint, you're looking at it from a couple different ways. Like obviously, there's been some more technologies that have come out. You have your sensory boards, you have your stroboscopic.
What are like, for anybody that maybe doesn't have them? Like, what are those things?
Yeah. So they're eyewear, and there's a couple different companies that make them, and essentially they flicker at different frequencies, and an athlete can wear them, on field. Whether they're a soccer athlete, basketball athlete, can wear them in pretty sport specific types of environments. Where that's helping out is like a couple different things, like focus of attention, whether it's central, peripheral vision, working memory, different sort of aspects like that. Reaction time obviously is
so like somebody's wearing the glasses and it's like opening, closing, and they're playing soccer or whatever.
Yeah,
now,
exactly.
If somebody doesn't have the money, could you tell them like, hey y'all, we're gonna do this linear tempo run and just blink your eyes a bunch of times? Is that right?
Not necessarily.
Is that better than nothing though? Is my question. Like, is that a little bit better than not?
Potentially, if an athlete can sustain a high frequency of blinking while they're doing any sort of high intensity task. I do get what you're saying, Justin. But so there's that type of technology, but there's also some of this sensory board technology that you start to see out, Synaptic, other types of technology. And I've used some of these different techs through grad school and some other labs that I've been in. Essentially, they're just trying to train some of these underlying qualities, like your reaction time, how well you can process information, your inhibitory control, like I need to react to this stimulus, but I don't want to react to this stimulus, something that you would see like on a football field or a soccer field, where there are certain stimuli on the field that an athlete, we don't want them to react to, but there's certain stimuli that we do want them to react to. So if you have the means and you have, obviously budgeting plays a role into this, like some of these technologies we've started to see have been helpful from training athletes from a sensory motor aspect. But again, that's more of like if you have the funds on the research side, but on the practitioner side, me being realistic in our environment and other environments out there, where I think the best bang for the buck, and there's been some, and I can send some links to this as well. I can't necessarily remember exactly who was publishing this, but small-sided games are where you're starting to see some interesting research come out there in improving some of these underlying sensory motor aspects. So 1v1 drills, 2v2, 2v1 type of training. A lot of this early research has been done in soccer where you see a lot of these, small-sided games, things like that. But we're starting to see some of these more field-specific training tasks or, training environments that we can put athletes in, improving some of these underlying sensory motor qualities. So that's kind of like from a practitioner-friendly standpoint, it's going to be these small-sided types of games where you're manipulating the spatial constraints, you're manipulating the temporal constraints on the field. And this is where athletes are having to react quicker. They're having to be more efficient in their processing of information, their inhibitory control. That's really, again, going to be a sport-specific thing that a practitioner has to, one, reverse engineer the demands of the game, and then how do we put them into these small-sided game type of environments where we're manipulating the spatial constraints and the temporal constraints that are hopefully driving and improving some of these underlying qualities. That's where my biggest recommendation now for a practitioner looking for something that I can do on a team perspective, I don't have technology, I don't have a budget to invest in this, it's going to be small-sided type of games. It's going to be your best bang for the buck.
Now, what kind of games? How would you have people do that in their off-season training as the strength and conditioning coach? And then how would you have them make recommendations to the sport coach? Because that's the other age-old question that everybody's asking is, how can I get this to be implemented by the sport coach so that way they don't hurt the athletes?
Yeah, sure. And what's nice about like soccer, for instance, is this is already pretty prevalent.
Soccer seems like the best sport to work with. I have not worked with soccer, but they seem to get it from like reading the tactical periodization book, listening to Frank talk. Like they seem like they get it.
Yeah. So and honestly, like from a sports science perspective, like European soccer, some of in the eastern parts of the world, like they've done a really good job. And that's where a lot of the influence comes in the American collegiate setting is from, the professional soccer influence in Europe and other places. They're really dialed in with a lot of this stuff. So soccer's a little bit easier just because that's more prevalent in terms of small-sided games is part of, our tactical periodization and some of the things that we do here at Clemson and some other places too, where that's already microdosed within athlete training. But for some of the other sports, like, American football, for instance, I think it really comes, and there are some folks that have started to, implement some of this similar type of training in American football. It really comes down to, having that conversation with, the sport coach and saying, look, this type of training can help our athletes react faster or make better decisions. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to talk about underlying sensory motor qualities to a sport coach. That's not their expertise.
They don't want to talk to us about anything to begin.
That's not their domain. But you got to kind of give them, gross overgeneralizations. Is like this type of training can help our DBs make quicker decisions and can help our running backs, when they're running through the hole, make a better decision. Like that's the sort of thing and the sort of information, the conversation that you have to have with a sport coach. But really, you're just trying to your underlying role here is just try to train some of these sensory motor qualities. Really, at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, one, from a visual perspective, our athletes to better recognize the stimuli that's in front of them or that's coming crashing down to the side of them. And then two, that's feeding down into the decisions that they're going to ultimately make. Because a lot of this sensory motor stuff that I'm talking about really comes from the eyes. Like visual attention, visual fixations, perception is really driving a lot of the cerebral cortex, responsible for 40% of the cerebral cortex, responsible for visual processing of information. All of this information that our athletes are seeing on the field, it's starting at the eyes. And
so is injury prevention, could this injury prevention, we know that's not a real word, but ACL, the original question was ACL injury prevention. Is something as simple as like, hey, training the eye to track and training the eye to be able to process information? Well,
that's where if you start to really dive into it, a lot of these types of devices, training strategies, like it really are, more visual dominant type of tasks, right? Like your strobe eyewear, right? What's that influencing? Your visual attention, your visual focus, your smartboard types of technology. They're seeing it and then they're reacting to it. So a lot of it is driven through the eye, but then two, reverse engineering the ACL injury. If you watch some of the video analysis, and researchers have started to do this, and you kind of go on your own tangent and look at different types of non-contact injuries that are out there, the common theme is that they're not looking at their knees, they're not looking at the ground, they're looking at what's in front of them or what may be coming toward them. They're trying to catch a ball. So like their visual attention is often elsewhere. But from my thoughts and my heuristics, it's if we can get athletes to one, be better visual processors of information and being able to see, what's relevant, what's not relevant, react quicker, then that's going to put them in potentially scenarios where they're not at these high risk for injuries, or you're seeing these quote unquote faulty types of biomechanics. Because at the end of the day, if our athletes had enough time and enough space, they could do any sort of task they want in a very low risk environment. It's when the spatial constraints, it's when the temporal constraints are severely constrained on an athlete, that's where you see these types of injuries. And that's what these idea of small-sided games are really trying to get at, is you're microdosing and progressing the temporal and the spatial constraints at the end of the day. So you can start more in large type of scenarios where you do like 5v5 type of drills or 5v5 plus one, and then you can start to make the spatial and the temporal constraints a little more restricted. You do more 2v2, smaller spaces, 3v2. So you're trying to microdose that and really dial into where an athlete has to make these just rapid decisions. They have to really be dialed in. That's at the end of the day what this type of field training is trying to do. It's not really anything super fancy or anything like that. You're just manipulating time and space. That's all we're attempting to do.
We talked off air about, the things that you would recommend or literature. Like, what would be some more things that you think our listeners need to know, or like sources that they could go and find?
Yeah, for sure. And a personal plug, I've published some of this research, some reviews that have kind of looked at some of the sensory motor, neuropsychological aspects, prior injury. One of the first papers actually that came out on this type of work was all the way back in 2007. A guy by the name of Buzz Swanick published a paper that looked at, I'm sure some of the listeners are familiar with the impact test, pretty common concussion assessment. Yeah, that student athletes will do, first year they come in as a freshman, or first time they come in as a high school freshman. And what they found there was a group of 200, I'm going to blank on the exact numbers here, but I think there was about 200 athletes total in this cohort. 100 that had a non-contact ACL injury, and then 100 matched controls, matched by sport.
Prior?
What's that?
How long prior?
How long? What do you mean? How long prior?
So you said they had 100 of them had an ACL injury. How long? So before,
it was after the impact testing. It was after the concussion test that they did.
Oh, so like did an impact test, got an ACL injury.
Yeah, exactly. And they were matched to a similar athlete that completed the baseline assessment that didn't have an future ACL injury. And I can link this as well. This is all the way back in 2007. So like 16 years ago, and then we started. Some folks started to look at it. What they found on that test was that the ones who did sustain a non-contact ACL injury, worse reaction time, worse processing speed, and worse working memory. Compared to the group that was, quote unquote, injury free going forward. That was all the way done in 2007. And I can share a couple other papers that Buzz has published. He's done some really insightful work and has really kind of influenced my understanding of an ACL injury and some of the mechanisms involved. Link that as well. And then there's been some other follow-up research, and I can another personal plug and some work I did with adolescent athletes fairly recently, where we had athletes preseason go through the attention network task. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of it because it's kind of hard to explain orally. When I send the link to the papers, you can see what the test actually was. While we weren't looking specifically at ACLs because we didn't have a large enough injury database of ACLs, we did find that worse attention on that task was associated with a higher risk of non-contact lower extremity injuries. So that included some ankle injuries, some other knee type of injuries. And there's been some other folks too that have also published in similar types of work. So that research is definitely not to the level that we've seen the biomechanics of ACL injury or the strength aspects of ACL injury, but we're starting to dive more and more into it in terms of, neuropsychologically from a sensory motor perspective, what are the mechanisms, and once the body of research starts to catch up, I think that's when you'll start to see more and more intervention type of training, which I've done a little bit in the past from a virtual reality standpoint, an eyewear standpoint, so on and so forth. So that's just, we're still kind of 20 years behind the biomechanics of the injury. And like I said at the very beginning of our chat here, Justin, is you can see knee valgus. You can't necessarily see someone who has bad working memory, like on the field. It's a lot more difficult to say, oh yeah, that athlete has bad processing speed, or that athlete has bad visual fixation or visual processing. But I can easily see an athlete who has really bad knee valgus. So that's where I think, start to add the brain into the equation, it just gets a lot more complicated. But that is to say, there's some exciting research that's being done, and I think we'll be in a better place as more of this line of work starts to come out.
Yeah, no, that was one thing listening to you talk. I was like, man, is it the unintelligent athlete that's going to get hurt more because they can't process and think about things?
Yeah, I suppose you could kind of think about it maybe from that lens, but I think at the end of the day, we're trying to understand, like, and you got to think about it too, like, elite level athletes tear their ACL. They're strong, they're robust, some of them have good biomechanics. Some elite athletes don't have good biomechanics, as we know. But I think it starts to kind of peel back more layers. And two, I'd recommend folks just go watch these non-contact ACL injuries on YouTube, things like that. There's some high-profile athletes who, we've all seen and things. Watch where they are looking visually and look at what's around them. Don't necessarily focus on the knee itself. Just look at where their attention is, and you'll start to really see it's like they're not focusing on how their knee is. They're not focusing on landing. They're not focusing on doing a drop.
Which is so annoying because that's what I feel like a lot of practitioners will be like, okay, when we're rehabbing, like, pay attention. And it's just like, you can't overly cue an athlete, like knee injury or back injury, like, oh, unrack the barbell and make sure you're at, it's like they're going to have chaos when they're playing their sport.
And that gets into the whole return to play progression too, is where you want to start microdosing this in as well. Obviously, initial part of the injury, it's going to be a lot of pre-planned scenarios. The athlete's just not ready yet to do that. But as you start to return to the field, you start to get into your return to running, agility type of training, that's when you need to start dosing in these reactive type of scenarios when an athlete is returning from an ACL. Because, unfortunately, we can provide the best practices, but we're not going to be able to prevent all of them. And then an athlete, and this gets into another really interesting line of research, is that when an athlete does tear their ACL, there are quite a bit of neuroplastic changes that occur in the brain, just because the ACL is, and that gets into a whole nother bag of worms. One of my previous colleagues, Dustin Grooms at the University of Ohio, has done a lot of work on this, and you see these neuroplastic alterations occur post ACL injury, just because the ACL is such a sensory motor powerhouse in the lower extremity and is responsible for a lot of this, proprioceptive feedback. When an athlete does sustain an ACL injury, you need to be extremely cognizant of how, when they get back onto the field, you're introducing some of this chaos. And Matt Taberner was pretty recently with the Orlando Magic, has done some of this work, this chaos control continuum, in terms of how that looks and when you're starting to dose in more of these chaotic environments. Because at the end of the day, like, an athlete's going to get back into the chaos post-injury. Like, they're going to get back onto the soccer field, they're going to get back onto the lacrosse field. And you don't want them to be doing a bunch of pre-planned cone ladder type of drills for 9 months, and then all of a sudden, boom, we're going to throw them into practice, or boom, we're going to throw them into a match. Like, that's going to be not leading to potentially a good outcome there. So you need to be cognizant of that side of things too. Or if you are dealing with an athlete post-injury, how are we going to start to implement some of these more reactive type of training strategies on the field? So that's, that gets into a whole kind of another line. But end of the day, like, my thoughts on the injury is like, yes, we've done a lot of biomechanics. We understand, like, okay, we understand knee valgus, we understand, large ground reaction forces. Like, we understand that extremely, extremely well. There's been millions, and I'm exaggerating, but there's been millions of papers put out, and there's literally probably been billions of dollars now poured into ACL research, but it just hasn't really moved the needle. It just hasn't moved the needle in terms of, like, seeing the incidence of this injury start to go down. And my thoughts about it is like, okay, I started with, pure biomechanics, but I don't think that's the end all be all. I'm just trying to add another layer that may be helpful for our athletes here, but then also too for other practitioners, because I like to share this information and like to just try to provide good science and good research to folks. I know there's a lot of other folks around the country, around the world, that are unfortunately, having to deal with these injuries in their athletes.
Amen, man. I feel like we could talk about this all day.
Yeah, I could too as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you, man. Why don't you let everybody know where they can follow you on social media, and if they can follow you on any, ResearchGate or where you're putting out.
Yeah. So social media is where I'm pretty active. Share a lot of my thoughts. Share like relevant, and I stay very, very up to date on the ACL. I actually get notifications from the NIH every week about the new ACL, because just as me now as being a practitioner, not doing super a ton or as much research as I used to, I still want to stay up to date, because if I find some relevant information out there, I'm going to provide that to our practitioners. Yeah. And things that we can do with our teams here at Clemson. But at Jason Avedesian, JasonAvedesian, that's going to be my Twitter handle. And honestly, that's where I'm most active and through the social media channel. So if folks want to reach out to me there, and just I use Twitter as like kind of like my running diary, just like my thoughts in general about things, sports science, a lot of ACL stuff, some concussion stuff too, just because I have a lot of interest still in the concussion space. But that's where probably folks can best connect with me on a lot of this stuff.
Sounds good, brother. Really appreciate you today, and have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, of course, Justin. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I like I said, love talking about this stuff, and hopefully this conversation, some further things, like just help some people out. You know, get them to think about it from a new perspective, and hopefully provide some value to a practitioner out there who may be unfortunately dealing with this, because it certainly hasn't gone away, and I don't think it's going away. But at least we can provide some helpful info out there.
Amen to that.
So appreciate your time, Justin.
Yeah, you too.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.